Will the real Poco M4 Pro please stand up? I'm only going to do this once for the video, just right at the beginning of the video. You're just going to have to deal with the fingerprint smudges. This is the Poco M4 Pro 5G, which I reviewed earlier in the year, and this is the Poco M4 Pro, which I just recently received. Came in the same lockbox as this flashy X4 Pro. This is representing a slight shift in design language, but you can imagine my confusion as a North American reviewer seeing this phone show up with roughly the same name as this phone, but with some slightly more significant differences than I think many of us are used to. I want to use this as a continuation of the conversation I was having during the X4 review that I've just posted on my channel, talking about what kinds of specs and features balance out 5G as a component that increases or messes around with phone pricing. It's one of the tricky philosophical issues when we talk about phones. If you call the phones something similar, you're going to expect similar price to performance. A lot of the under the hood differences aren't going to be radically different. And again, I've just flipped these things over and the angle, slightly off angle, how much dimmer this screen looks. I just want to show real quick, if we max out the brightness for both of these guys, I don't think I've got my camera set to properly expose. Yeah, the M4 is kind of blowing out my exposure settings here. Now, both phones are of course rocking the absolutely fantastic power button fingerprint sensor. This is a hallmark of Xiaomi's parts bin. I greatly prefer this over in-display fingerprint sensors. Both have comparable headphone jacks. Speaker output is pretty similar. Dual SIM, SD card expansion. They're both really well full-featured mobile communicator devices. One other smaller but definitely noticeable difference between the two, the haptic feedback. I kind of like the haptic motor a little bit better on the 5G variant. The motor on the M4 Pro, it's a little bit more powerful, but it's got that fuzz, fuzz, fuzz kind of feel to it. It's a little less precise. I don't think it's anything that contributes to the price, but I do like the new design language that Poco is going for. The sides are a little flatter, a little more angular. I really like the full width camera bar. So on the Poco 5G version, you've got that waka waka waka. You got that table rattle here on the camera module. On the M4 Pro, nothing. This thing is a lot more stable just because the entire camera assembly runs the width of the phone. But that does bring us to one of the more significant differences between these two phones. Camera technologies. Again, specs on paper, you wouldn't expect these to be fantastically different. We've got 50 megapixels over here and 64 megapixels over there. I guess the 5G cut 14 megapixels. That's probably fine. But if you followed any of my camera commentaries, you know that this is a more complex conversation than just them megapixels. The sensor that's being used here on the M4 Pro 5G is a smaller sensor than what's being used on the M4 Pro. As we're comparing the sort of photographic elements of what goes into a smartphone camera sensor, the size of this piece of camera hardware is more akin to some of the older phones, like this is my LG G8, whereas the 64 megapixel sensor here is closer to my LG V60. This is a newer sensor, but it's smaller. This is an older sensor, but it's bigger. And we also do have to kind of compare and contrast some of the software differences between these two phones. I think the photos you can get out of the M4 Pro have a slightly nicer quality to them in those photographic elements, a slightly shallower depth of field, but this sensor is better at clearing data, especially for this lower power SoC hardware. The guts of these phones are a little bit more battery efficient. So we can pull off 1080p at 60 frames per second in video here. We're kind of stuck with 1080p 30 on this phone here. We've got this interesting race of pros and cons. This is a phone I like a little bit more for video. This is a phone I like a little bit more for stills photography. But we can kind of wrap up on that general idea point for point for point. We're seeing the rest of the world as 5G really starts rolling out in numerous markets. We've got to have those conversations. What does 5G bring to the table? And when we're trying to keep phones in a certain price tier, how does that move us around the guts of the phone? How does that make for different component choices and what really contributes more to your experience. I do think it's fair to say there are some people out there who might be concerned about having a phone with the better radio support. Maybe they are looking at getting 5G in their area soon. It's something that they're interested in. But how do we quantify these experiences for someone who maybe isn't as interested in 5G, but they see the same name of the same phone? Well, which one's really going to offer them the better overall experience? I want to be careful because tech reviewers can get kind of locked into brand and label. We see Poco M4 and we have a certain expectation as to what that phone should be, but I'm sitting in front of two Poco M4 Pros and they don't feel as similar as that label would suggest, because we were looking at the differences from the Poco X3 to the X4 and that how that changes what this phone is trying to represent. It's no longer the same kind of budget performance flagship killer. This is now, and it's advertised by Xiaomi as the all-around ace. So I'd love to hear in the comments below, especially folks who've had a little bit more experience with Xiaomi sub-brands than I have. I'm still kind of getting my sea legs here. I'm getting through a couple generations of Pocos now. I finally got to play with some Redmis. How do you think 5G is contributing to the smartphone landscape? And how are you making recommendations for your family and friends? Someone comes to you and says, hey, I want a really solid, inexpensive phone. What direction are you steering people based on these types of product differences? Drop me some comments down below. I'd love to get into a chat about this, especially with a little bit more of an international focus, because I'm still hoping that we'll get more products like this in the United States. And stay tuned for an upcoming comparison. I'm looking at an Infinix, I'm looking at some TCL, I'm looking at Pocos and Redmis, and I'm definitely staging up for a camera deep dive on one of these inexpensive phones. Just because we're seeing some big number tech, I kind of want to see what that means for real world performance. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching, for sharing, subscribing. All the support's been fantastic. Please consider joining the list of names scrolling by on your screen right now. That's coming courtesy of my Patreon, patreon.com/somegadgetguy. Full list of all my affiliates and partnerships, somegadgetguy.com. And you know where you can find me on the rest of the internet, at somegadgetguy on the Twitters and the Twitches and the Facebooks and the Instagrams. And I will catch you all on the next video.